Hi then. So, I couldn't think of an intro, so I decided to make the intro about having no intro. It's part 6 of the So You Want to Be a Tuner series. And as I mentioned in the end of the last video, in this video we're going to discuss power. Now, contrary to what you may be expecting, I'm not going to be discussing each individual aspect of power, upgrades and this, that and the other, what each thing does to the car, like I have been with suspension, etc. And the reason why I'm not going to go that in depth is because as far as racing games, there's not that much fine tuning that you can really do, with regard to power upgrades. It's just a case of either stock or fitted. That's about as far as the tuning goes. They don't let you fine tune stuff as far as power upgrades for the most part. So instead of discussing the individual aspects, I thought it would be more beneficial for you guys to discuss how you can identify engine types, what a certain engine combined with a certain car is best at, how you should tune that to achieve what you want for whatever track and whatever type of racing you're trying to achieve. So how do you identify an engine type and what it's best at? Well, first of all, select what the engine is. Is it a petrol? Is it a diesel? If it's a petrol, it'll probably have higher power, higher revs, but lower torque. If it's a diesel, it'll have probably much higher torque, maybe not so much power, and much lower revs. Or it could be perhaps a case of thinking, is it a piston engine? Is it a straight engine? Is it a V-type engine? Is it a rotary engine? What type of engine is it? Is it an electric motor, for instance? And then identifying what is that engine good for, and does that suit what I'm trying to purpose that car for? Now, to some degree, you can purpose any engine for any track. But if you really want to make a car outstandingly good, you need to fit or match up the right engine for the right purpose. So for instance, for drag racing, you could use a petrol because it gives you good top end, but you'd be just as successful, if not more so, using a diesel because of the huge amount of torque that diesels produce in the low revs. That means that because they produce all of that torque and most of their power in the lower power band, in a much lower power band than a petrol, that means that that power and torque is going to get from the engine to the road much quicker than a petrol. So that's something to consider, using a diesel as a drag car. What about for circuit racing, for instance? Well, that depends entirely on the track. If it's a big, wide open track with lots of straights, say for instance like Spa or La Sarthe, aka the Lemoore, or a track like that, or something like Road America, maybe Silverstone, that kind of track with a lot of longer, open, very high-speed straights, then you will probably want to consider using a petrol engine more than a diesel. And the reason for that is because, as I said just now, diesels produce their best power and torque in the lower rev range. So the faster you go, when you get into very high revs and high speed, diesels start to lose out on their performance when compared to their equivalent vehicles if it had a petrol engine rather than a diesel. So commonly, for instance, in the Lemoore, if you were to compare a diesel racing car to a petrol racing car, the diesel would be very quick in the low end corners, very quick out of corners, and mid-range very quick because of the torque. But on the Mulsanne section, of a great big long straight on the Lemoore, primarily without the chicanes, obviously, ultimately the petrol car in real life would have the top speed advantage. Now on the game, Gran Turismo and Forza, not sure so much about other racing games that feature both petrols and diesels, but on both of those games they're not so realistic in that regard, because on those games, especially Gran Turismo, the diesels are very good top end, which isn't that realistic, to be honest. But that's the way it is. And this is the problem for me telling you guys. I can give you guys the best advice in the world. I'm not saying that it is, but if I were to give you the best advice in the world, it wouldn't necessarily help you 100% because you and I are still dependent on how realistic the game itself is. So that's something else you always need to consider. How realistic is the game? And just do a bit of testing. See what the game presents certain engines and certain cars as being good at. Because as well as knowing in your own mind what they should be good at, you can then compare that to how good they actually are in the game. And that will give you a very, very accurate representation of what this game, basically how this game maps out its performance, how realistic those representations are, and then you can just take it from there in terms of tuning and using what car for what purpose. So as we've said, for more wider open tracks, more commonly you'll probably want to use a Petrol. But for tracks that are like twisty, city tracks, especially tracks that have uphill sections like the Nürburgring, the extra punchy low-end torque of a diesel will give you advantage on those tracks. Then you've got other engines, as we've said, like electric motors, rotaries. The great thing about electric motors is, as some of you will already know, unlike petrols, diesels, rotaries, whatever, electric motors don't have to work up through their power band. They work in a completely different way. Because electricity is much quicker than all the mechanical moving parts of a combustion engine, electric motors produce 100% of their power and torque instantly. The downside to electric vehicles is generally they're not fitted with multiple gears. They tend to only have one forward gear, at the most maybe 2 or 3. And although that does mean they're simpler and you have much more smooth measured out acceleration, it does give you a slight disadvantage, because for the most part it means that whatever ratio those gears are on, you can't really have everything. You're either going to have pretty good acceleration but lose out top end, or good top end and lose out on the low end acceleration. So as far as electric motors, you do really need to decide what you want the vehicle for. And as far as rotaries I'm a big fan of. It's a fantastic engine. In real life they have some issues in terms of fuel economy and the fact that you have to rebuild, in the case of Mazda anyway, the engines or the rotors have to be rebuilt, I think it's every 60,000 miles, because of the wear, the constant wear, because of the way the engines work. But apart from that, they are fantastic engines, in my opinion. They're kind of like motorbike engines in a sense, very high revving, very high power, similar kind of sound to a high performance motorbike. But the one great thing about rotary engines is, unlike motorbikes, they actually produce a very high amount of torque for their size, as well as power. Now, as far as I'm aware, there are no diesel rotaries produced at the moment. I think Mazda made a concept diesel rotary, but it would be fantastic if that ever did reach production, because a diesel rotary, if it turned out anything like I imagine it turning out, that would be a pretty immense engine. Because then you'd have all that torque, but in a very small, lightweight, high-revving package, and that could potentially be a fantastic engine. But anyway, that's speculative. As we said, it doesn't exist. But for the most part, rotaries are very simple to tune, and that's the great thing about them. They're good for, pretty much any track. They're great top end, great mid-range, and great low end, because they have that torque and power blended perfectly. So I'm a big advocate of rotary engines. As far as petrols, like we said, better for long open-ended tracks and top speed racing, whereas diesels, depending on, as we said, the realism of the game, should be better for twisty tracks, uphill sections, and also potentially rallying. Diesel engine vehicles should be quite good for rallying because of the torque. So that's something to bear in mind. As far as I'm aware, there aren't that many diesel rally cars really. I don't think there are any diesel rally cars on Gran Turismo or Forza, not at the moment anyway. Not that I can think of. But if you do get the chance to repurpose a diesel road car on Gran Turismo or Forza as a rally car, I would recommend doing so, or at least giving it a try, because you should find it will be quite good. So that's about all I was going to go into for power. So yeah, that's about it really. There's nothing else particularly to do with power that I wanted to discuss. So in the next video we'll begin talking about weight loss with vehicles, when should and shouldn't you try to make the vehicle as light as possible, what are the benefits and drawbacks, because making a vehicle lighter does have drawbacks, surprisingly, and when it's beneficial to or to not do so. So I'd appreciate feedback as always. Hope you found this beneficial, and as always, thanks for watching.